today we're digging into the really fascinating story of the United States. We're working from this incredibly detailed documentary you've shared, and our goal is simple. Pull out the most important bits, the surprising facts, those aha moments that, make history click.
That's the plan. We're going to trace the journey of this modern Roman Empire, right from the very first people here all the way up to its place in the world today.
Yeah, and not just what happened, but really getting into why it matters, how the past still echoes now.
Exactly. How events back then are still shaping things for you today.
Okay, sounds great. Let's unpack this incredible story. Where do we start? Right at the beginning.
Right at the beginning. And what's crucial to grasp, even before we talk about Europeans, is that North America was already buzzing with life. For thousands of years, complex, sophisticated native societies were here.
Right, not just scattered tribes, but actual governments.
Absolutely. Intricate systems of governance, diplomacy, war, peace. They had deep roots in this land long before anyone else arrived.
And here's something that often gets, glossed over. We all learn about Columbus in 1492, right? But the documentary points out something pretty surprising.
Leif Erikson.
Leif Erikson. Nearly 500 years before Columbus, around 1000 CE, a Norse navigator landed in Newfoundland. Losomedo, they called it?
Guided there by Bjarni Hurdolfsson, who actually spotted the landmass, first by accident. But yes, Erikson established a settlement.
That's amazing. So why isn't he the famous one?
Well, the settlement didn't last. Maybe 20 years or so, then it was abandoned. And crucially, those records, the Norse sagas, weren't widely known in the rest of Europe later on.
So it was almost like a historical footnote that got lost for a while. That's a real aha moment. Makes you question the simple narrative.
It really does. So fast forward almost 500 years. October 1492, Christopher Columbus, sailing for Spain, lands in the West Indies. He didn't know he'd found a new continent, but his arrival, it kicks open the door.
Right. Inadvertently opened this vast new frontier. And again, the name. It wasn't Columbus who got the naming rights, was it?
No. That was Amerigo Vespucci, a Florentine explorer. He traveled there later, promoted this idea of a new world, made maps.
And somehow his first name stuck to the whole hemisphere. America.
That's how it happened. And by the start of the 1500s, it was a mad dash. Spain, England, Portugal, even Sweden and the Dutch, France. Everyone wanted a piece of the action. Exploring, mapping the East Coast, staking claims.
And John Cabot, Giovanni Caboto.
Right, sailing for England. He landed in Newfoundland again in 1497. Since Erikson's voyage was basically unknown then, Cabot got credited by the English and eventually others as the discoverer of North America.
Okay, so the race is on. Europe's powers are descending on this continent that's already home to established societies. What were those first encounters like?
It was mixed, Sometimes they were sharing, exchanging gifts, information, moments of curiosity on both sides. But tragically, the Europeans also brought diseases, smallpox, measles, things native populations had no immunity to.
Oh, devastating.
Absolutely devastating. Widespread illness, huge loss of life in many native communities. It completely changed the dynamic of those early encounters.
And just surviving, setting up a colony, it was incredibly tough. You really see that with the English attempts at Roanoke Island.
The Lost Colony had two main attempts.
The first one, 1585, mostly soldiers. They seem to have antagonized the locals pretty quickly, burned a village.
Right, the Aquascogok village. Communication broke down, violence erupted, disease hit them hard. That attempt failed.
Then they tried again, 1587, more middle-class folks, families this time.
Yes, but they also struggled immensely.
Yeah.
And then they just vanished. The relief mission arrives years later, and all that's left is a palisade and that single word carved into a tree. Croatoan.
Chilling. Just gone. It's a mystery that still captures the imagination.
It really does. And it highlights the sheer difficulty. In contrast, the first permanent European settlement wasn't English, it was Spanish. St. Augustine, Florida, 1564.
And they established it after kicking out a French colony.
Exactly. They sacked a French Huguenot settlement that was already there. Shows the competitive, often violent nature of this early colonization.
So permanence was hard won. Jamestown, 1607.
Wow.
The English settlers there were mostly looking for gold, right?
No.
Not planning to farm.
Pretty much. They landed in a swampy, unhealthy area. Disease hit them hard, too. They got some help from the Powhatan people initially, but things soured. It really took Captain John Smith imposing, almost dictatorial command to bring any stability.
Not exactly the cooperative ideal. And Plymouth, 1620, the Pilgrims.
They had a brutal first winter,
Yeah.
lived on the ship, the Mayflower, while they struggled to build shelter. Their first real meaningful contact with the local Wampanoag people didn't happen until March 1621.
And this is where Squanto comes in. Tisquantum. His story is incredible.
It really is. A Patuxet man, one of the few survivors of his village, which had been wiped out by disease, likely brought by earlier European fishermen or explorers. He'd actually been kidnapped, taken to Europe, learned English, escaped, made his way back, only to find his home gone. He was living with the Wampanoag. Because he spoke English, he became this absolutely vital interpreter.
The crucial link.
The crucial link between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag, led by their chief, Massasoit. Squanto helped them negotiate an agreement, basically a non-aggression pact. That initial cooperation, brokered by someone who understood both worlds, was key.
And that led to the famous First Thanksgiving.
That's the traditional story, yes. In the fall of 1621, a harvest celebration shared by the Pilgrims and Wampanoag lasted 3 days, apparently. A moment of fragile coexistence.
Fragile indeed. Because as more English settlements popped up throughout the 1600s, absorbing places like Plymouth into the bigger Massachusetts Bay Colony, trade grew, but so did the potential for conflict.
Definitely. And the continent became this contested space between empires. By the late 17th century, Spain controlled a huge swath. The Deep South, Midwest, parts of the West pushing up from Florida. France, England's big rival, was focused on Canada and the Mississippi Valley.
Which meant more friction, more raids on settlements.
Raids were common on the frontiers. Colonial governments often couldn't protect everyone. And this led to larger, more organized conflicts. King Philip's War in 1675 is a major example.
Metacomet, right, Massasoit's son.
Yes, known to the English as King Philip. He had none of his father's tolerance for the settlers constantly encroaching on Wampanoag land, arguing over livestock, pushing their religion.
So he united different tribes.
A powerful alliance of Algonquian tribes. They hit settlements hard, both small farms and larger towns across New England. The colonial militias responded brutally, targeting native villages directly.
How did it end?
Metacomet was eventually hunted down and killed in 1676 and broke the back of the resistance. Wampanoag and their Narragansett allies were nearly destroyed, forced out of New England entirely. It was up to that point the bloodiest war fought in North America, left deep scars.
And the wars between European powers just kept spilling over.
Constantly. King William's War in the late 1600s was the first of 4 huge conflicts between France and England and North America, and their native allies were always drawn in, making the fighting even more widespread and brutal.
It's wild how interconnected it all was, like the War of Jenkins' Ear. Started because a British captain claimed the Spanish cut off his ear over some sugar.
Sounds bizarre, right?
Yeah.
But Captain Robert Jenkins showed his preserved ear to Parliament. It struck a nerve back in England about Spanish interference with trade. Even though there wasn't much fighting in North America from that specific war, it shows how these imperial tensions could ignite over seemingly small incidents.
And connecting the dots, King George's War here was the War of Austrian Succession in Europe.
Exactly. A massive global conflict over who should inherit the Austrian throne. But it played out with battles between British and French colonists and their native allies right here.
Which all leads up to the big one, the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War, globally.
Right. Started technically in 1754 with a young George Washington, actually. He was forced to surrender a small fort, Fort Necessity, to the French in the Ohio Valley.
And Britain immediately sent troops.
And they did, sent regulars over to attack French forts. But the early campaigns didn't go well for the British. The French, with their allies, captured key forts like Ticonderoga and William Henry. Things looked grim for Britain initially.
What turned it around?
A major shift in strategy and resources. France started pouring more effort into the war in Europe, which they saw as more critical. Britain seized the opportunity.
And the British Navy played a big role.
Crucial. They blockaded the St. Lawrence River, cutting off French supplies and reinforcements to Canada. That was huge. Then came the big victories, capturing Fort Niagara, the massive Fortress Louisbourg, and finally, the decisive battle for Quebec City.
And that basically sealed the deal in North America.
Pretty much. General Jeffrey Amherst secured the formal surrender of New France in 1760. The war officially ended worldwide with the Treaty of Paris in 1763. But the cost, astronomical. Maybe up to 1.4 million casualties globally.
And the result for Britain?
A massive territorial gain. They got Canada, all the French land east of the Mississippi River. Suddenly, Britain had this enormous empire in North America.
Okay, so Britain's empire is huge, but let's shift gears slightly. What was happening culturally, religiously during this time? Protestantism was important.
Hugely important, not just as a faith, but it was deeply intertwined with the colonization effort itself. Many ventures were funded or justified on religious grounds.
And then there's the Great Awakening.
Right, this intense period of evangelical revival, really a global phenomenon in the early to mid-18th century, but it swept through the American colonies. It brought new ideas about personal salvation, rebirth.
Delivered by traveling preachers.
Exactly. Itinerant preachers who drew massive crowds. George Whitefield is a famous example. The documentary mentions he supposedly drew over 30,000 people in Boston in 1740.
30,000. In Boston. What was the population then?
About 17,000. So nearly double the city's population came out to hear him. That's an aha moment right there about the power of this movement and maybe an early sign of Americans' capacity for, mass mobilization.
And this influenced the people who would later lead the revolution.
Absolutely. It shaped the thinking of many future founding fathers and mothers, ideas about individual conscience, questioning authority, community action. But we have to juxtapose this with a much darker reality.
Slavery.
Slavery was expanding rapidly. The number of enslaved Africans forcibly brought to the colonies exploded, from around 300,000 in the early 1600s to over 2 million by the mid-1700s. This brutal system was becoming deeply embedded in the colonial economy, especially in the South, setting the stage for future conflict.
So Britain wins this huge war, gets all this land, but victory comes with costs. And tensions flared up almost immediately, didn't they?
Right away. The colonists were thrilled about the new western lands opened up by the Treaty of Paris in 1763, ready to push west.
But the land wasn't empty.
Far from it. It was occupied by the Iroquois, other native tribes, who had their own established territories and political systems. To avoid more costly wars with them, King George III issued the Royal Proclamation of 1763. The proclamation, exactly, forbidding colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains, creating a vast Indian reserve. This infuriated many colonists and land speculators. Did they listen? Many didn't. They ignored it, pushed west anyway, which of course just increased friction with native tribes and also with the British authorities trying to enforce the line.
But the bigger issue wasn't land, it was money, right? Paying for the war.
That was the heart of it. Parliament needed to pay off the massive debt from the 7 Years' War, so they started passing acts, levying taxes on the colonies.
Now, were these taxes really high?
Actually, no. Often they were relatively low, sometimes even designed to make British goods cheaper than French or Dutch imports. The core issue for the colonists wasn't the amount, it was the principle.
The lack of consultation.
Precisely. They saw themselves as British subjects, entitled to certain rights. And a fundamental right was not being taxed without their consent, without having representatives in Parliament who voted on those taxes.
Britain argued they had virtual representation.
They did. The idea that Parliament represented all British subjects wherever they were. But Americans increasingly rejected that. They wanted actual representation, which led to that famous slogan.
No taxation without representation.
That became the rallying cry. It wasn't just about pounds and shillings. It was about self-government.
So, how did it escalate? What were the key acts?
It started rolling with the Sugar Act in 1764. Regulated sugar and molasses imports. Colonists protested, organized boycotts of British goods. Didn't cripple the British economy, but Parliament definitely noticed.
Then the Stamp Act, 1765.
That was a big one. It was the first direct tax levied specifically on the colonies by Parliament. Required stamps on all sorts of paper goods, legal documents, newspapers, even playing cards.
And the reactions?
Immediate and fierce. You saw secret groups like the Sons of Liberty pop up, using intimidation, sometimes violence, against the stamp distributors. Lieutenant Governor Thomas Hutchinson's house in Boston was famously ransacked.
But it wasn't just mobs, right? There was political organization, too.
Absolutely. 9 colonies sent delegates to the Stamp Act Congress in New York. They issued a Declaration of Rights, arguing that taxation without representation violated their fundamental rights as men. And the boycotts started to bite economically. British imports dropped significantly.
Ben Franklin even argued their case in London.
He did. Went before Parliament, warned them that pushing too hard could lead to rebellion. The pressure worked, partly. Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in 1766. Huge celebrations in the colonies.
But there was a catch.
A big catch. The same day, they passed the Declaratory Act. It basically said, okay, we're repealing this tax, but don't forget, we have the absolute right to make laws for you colonies in all cases whatsoever.
So both sides felt they'd won something, but the core issue was unresolved. A door left open, as the documentary put it.
Exactly. And it didn't take long for tensions to flare up again. The Sons of Liberty got active again in Boston. Customs officials felt threatened, actually fled the city. So Britain sent troops.
Occupying Boston, that sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It was. The tension was palpable, which leads us to March 5, 1770, the Boston Massacre.
What exactly happened there?
It started with a confrontation between a lone British sentry and a growing hostile crowd. Snowballs, rocks, insults were thrown. Other soldiers came to back him up. Then a shot rang out. Who fired first? Unclear. But the soldiers then fired into the crowd. 5 colonists were killed.
A turning point, sure.
A major escalation. Paul Revere's famous engraving, while somewhat propagandistic, spread the news and inflamed passions across the colonies. But the legal aftermath is also really telling.
John Adams defended the soldiers.
He did, the future president. Believed deeply that everyone deserved a fair trial, even hated occupying soldiers. He got 6 acquitted entirely, 2 convicted of manslaughter, not murder. It solidified his belief in a government of laws, not mobs.
But the resentment kept building. What was the final straw?
The Intolerable Acts, as the colonists called them, passed by Parliament after the Boston Tea Party. They were designed to punish Massachusetts, close Boston Harbor, restrict town meetings. Parliament hoped to isolate Massachusetts.
Did it work?
It backfired spectacularly. Instead of isolating Massachusetts, it united the colonies in outrage. Many saw it as proof that Britain intended to strip away all their rights. Resentment turned into outright hatred for many.
So that led to the Continental Congress.
Yes, the First Continental Congress met in fall 1774. 12 colonies sent delegates. Georgia held out initially. They condemned the Intolerable Acts, organized more boycotts, petitioned the king again, got no formal reply.
So the Second Continental Congress meets in May 1775.
Yeah.
Still hoping for reconciliation.
Some were, perhaps.
Yeah.
They tried more boycotts, sought a response, but events were moving fast. General Thomas Gage, the British commander in Boston, got wind of a colonial weapons stash in Concord.
And planned to seize it.
He did, but the Sons of Liberty found out. Paul Revere and others rode out to warn the militia.
The famous midnight ride.
That's the one. So April 19, 1775, British troops march towards Lexington and Concord. They meet the militia on Lexington Green. Someone fires a shot. The shot heard around the world. Fighting breaks out. The war had begun.
So the war starts. Early battles like Bunker Hill, costly for the British, even though they won the ground. It became clear pretty quickly the colonies needed to work together, right?
Absolutely. If they fought as 13 separate entities, they'd be picked off one by one.
Yeah.
The Second Continental Congress realized this, their crucial decision. Form a unified army.
The Continental Army.
Yes, and they needed a commander. The choice was George Washington.
Why him specifically? His battlefield record wasn't exactly amazing at that point.
It wasn't stellar, no. But he had significant military experience from the French and Indian War. He looked the part, commanded respect, and crucially, he was from Virginia.
Getting the powerful southern colonies on board.
Exactly. His appointment helped bridge the gap between North and South. He was chosen unanimously, a huge step toward unity.
But this new army, it faced enormous problems.
Oh, massive problems. Supplies were a nightmare. Food shortages led to tension, sometimes outright conflict, with the civilian population they were supposed to protect. You had troops from different colonies, different traditions, different levels of discipline. Getting them to work together under a unified command was a constant struggle.
What about early military actions? The invasion of Canada.
That was a disaster. 1775. Led by Montgomery and Benedict Arnold. They hoped to rally Canadians to their cause. Didn't happen. Montgomery was killed, Arnold wounded, many captured or died of smallpox during a brutal winter siege of Quebec. A major setback.
Meanwhile, Washington was focused on Boston.
Yes, bottling up the British army there was a long siege. He lacked the heavy cannons needed to force them out. Until
Henry Knox.
Henry Knox, an incredible feat. He was a bookseller turned artillery chief. In the dead of winter, he led an expedition to Fort Ticonderoga, which the Americans had captured earlier, and dragged dozens of heavy cannons hundreds of miles back to Boston over snow and ice.
An amazing logistical achievement.
Truly remarkable. Once those guns were positioned overlooking the harbor in March 1776, the British fleet and army were vulnerable. They had no choice but to evacuate Boston, a huge morale boost for the Americans.
So while the fighting is happening, the thinking is shifting in Philadelphia.
Dramatically. The Second Continental Congress started out hoping for redress of grievances, but now they're running a war. They sent one last appeal to the king, the Olive Branch Petition, in July 1775.
How did that go over?
King George III refused to even read it. He declared the colonies in open rebellion, the Congress members traitors. That slammed the door shut on reconciliation.
So people like Adams, Franklin, Jefferson, they realized there was no going back.
They did. They understood that to win, they needed help, specifically from France, Britain's great rival. But France wouldn't openly back a mere rebellion. They might back a new independent nation fighting for its sovereignty.
So independence became a strategic necessity, not just a philosophical goal.
Exactly. It was the key to unlocking foreign aid. So on June 11, 1776, Congress appointed a committee to draft a declaration. Thomas Jefferson did most of the writing.
Laying out the reasons for separating, the philosophy of rights.
Yes, affirming rights as men. Life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. Though it's important to note, a section condemning the slave trade, written by Jefferson, was removed during the debates.
A compromise to keep the southern colonies on board.
A necessary compromise for unity at that moment, highlighting the deep contradiction at the nation's founding. The final version was adopted by Congress on July 2nd, then formally ratified and dated July 4th, 1776.
And those words, "We hold these truths to be self-evident."
Instantly iconic, it transformed the conflict. This wasn't just a tax revolt anymore, it was a revolution, a fight for a new kind of nation based on radical ideas of equality and rights. The spirit soared when the declaration was read to the troops.
But reading inspiring words doesn't win battles. The war continued, and it got rough for Washington's army.
Very rough. The British launched a massive attack on New York in August 1776. Washington suffered heavy defeats, forced into a long, desperate retreat across New Jersey. Morale plummeted. It looked like the revolution might collapse.
But then a turning point in 1777, or rather two turning points.
Yes, a complex year. On the one hand, the British captured Philadelphia, the American capital. Washington lost battles at Brandywine and Germantown, forcing his army into that famously harsh winter encampment at Valley Forge. Things looked bleak.
But elsewhere,
A stunning American victory. British General John Burgoyne marched south from Canada, aiming to cut off New England. He captured Fort Ticonderoga again, but his army got bogged down, supply lines stretched thin. At Saratoga, New York, he was surrounded and forced to surrender his entire army to American forces led by Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold before his later treason.
Saratoga, that was huge, wasn't it?
Monumental. It proved the Americans could win a major conventional battle. And crucially, it convinced France that the U.S. was a viable ally. France formally entered the war on the American side, providing money, troops, and critically, naval power. That changed everything.
So Britain shifts strategy again, focuses on the South?
They did. Starting around 1779, they hoped to rally loyalist support there. They captured Savannah, then Charleston, major victories for them. But then Nathaniel Greene took command of the American forces in the South.
Washington's trusted subordinate.
Yes, and a brilliant strategist. He realized he couldn't beat the British in major pitched battles. Instead, he used militia, partisans, fought a war of attrition, hit-and-run tactics. He harassed their supply lines, drew them deep into the Carolina backcountry, wearing them down. Key victories at Kings Mountain and Cowpens boosted American morale.
And it became a civil war within a civil war in the Carolinas.
Absolutely brutal. Patriots versus loyalists, neighbor against neighbor. The fighting was vicious. Eventually, the main British army under Lord Cornwallis was exhausted. Greene maneuvered towards the coast, towards Yorktown, Virginia.
Setting the trap.
Exactly. Washington rushed his army south to New York, coordinating with the French army. And crucially, the French Navy blockaded Chesapeake Bay, cutting off any British escape or reinforcement by sea. Cornwallis was trapped.
The final major battle.
Yorktown. After a siege, Cornwallis surrendered his entire army on October 19, 1781. That was essentially the end of major fighting. The Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, formally recognizing the United States as a sovereign, independent nation.
Victory. But now came the challenge of governing this new nation. They had the Articles of Confederation adopted back in 77.
Yes, during the war.
Okay.
But it created a very weak central government. It was more like a league of friendship between 13 independent states.
And that caused problems.
Big problems. The national government had no power to tax effectively, couldn't regulate trade between states, couldn't really enforce its own laws or treaties. States squabbled over borders, printed their own money. It was becoming chaotic, an economic and political mess within just a few years.
What was the wake-up call that things needed to change?
Shays' Rebellion in 1786 really shook people. Daniel Shays, a Revolutionary War veteran, led an uprising of farmers in Massachusetts. They were losing their farms to foreclosure, burdened by debt and taxes they couldn't pay. The rebellion highlighted how powerless the federal government was. It couldn't raise an army easily, couldn't manage the economy.
Couldn't even get the British to leave forts on U.S. soil.
Exactly. Because the U.S. wasn't fulfilling as part of the Treaty of Paris regarding debts and loyalist property, the British just stayed put in some Western forts. The Articles government couldn't force them out or resolve the issue. It was clear the system wasn't working.
So the Constitutional Convention, Philadelphia, May 1787.
Delegates arrived, initially just to amend the Articles. But they quickly realized that wasn't enough. They needed a whole new structure. What emerged was this radical design for a federal republic with checks and balances.
The three branches, let's break that down. Legislative.
Congress, made up of two houses. The House of Representatives, with representation based on state population, bigger states get more seats. And the Senate, where every state gets 2 senators, regardless of size. Equal representation there.
And their powers.
Making laws, levying taxes, declaring war, controlling the budget. The House can impeach federal officials. The Senate holds the trial and confirms presidential appointments, ratifies treaties, checks within the branch and on other branches.
Right? Executive branch.
And the president, elected indirectly through the Electoral College. Powers include executing the laws Congress passes, vetoing legislation, commanding the armed forces, conducting foreign policy, appointing judges and other officials.
And judicial.
The Supreme Court and lower federal courts. Their main job is interpreting the laws, settling disputes between states, and crucially, ensuring laws align with the Constitution, the principle of judicial review, although that developed more fully later.
What was so innovative about this whole structure?
Well, the system of checks and balances itself was pretty novel. But perhaps the most radical idea, as the documentary notes, was grounding the government's legitimacy in we the people. The idea that the government derived its power directly from the citizens, not from the states or a monarch.
Drafting it was one thing, getting it ratified was another. It wasn't unanimous.
No, the Articles required unanimity, which was impossible. The Constitution only required 9 out of 13 states to ratify. Still a high bar. To convince the public, Hamilton, Madison, and Jay wrote the Federalist Papers.
85 essays arguing for the Constitution.
Brilliant arguments, published anonymously at first. They explained the structure, defended the stronger central government, but there was strong opposition.
The Anti-Federalists.
Right. They feared the new government would be too powerful, would trample on states' rights and individual liberties. They worried about the lack of a specific Bill of Rights initially.
But the Federalists won out.
They did. State by state, conventions debated and voted. New Hampshire became the crucial 9th state to ratify on June 21st, 1788. The Constitution became the new law of the land. A new government was about to begin.
Okay, the Constitution is ratified. Time to actually make this new government work. First president. No surprise there.
George Washington, unanimously elected again, the hero of the Revolution. John Adams became vice president. They took office in 1789.
How did Washington approach governing? Did he pick a side, Federalist or Anti-Federalist?
He tried to stay above the factions, but his policies generally leaned Federalist, strengthening the national government. He knew the new nation was fragile. His genius was partly in surrounding himself with brilliant people from both sides. Jefferson as Secretary of State, Hamilton as Treasury Secretary, intense rivals, but Washington managed them.
What were his main domestic priorities?
Establishing financial stability was key. He backed Hamilton's plan for the federal government to assume state debts, create a national bank, impose tariffs. Controversial, but it put the U.S. on a firmer financial footing. He also oversaw the selection of a permanent capital city, Washington, D.C.
And he wasn't afraid to use the power of the presidency, the Whiskey Rebellion.
Right, 1790. Farmers in western Pennsylvania violently protested a federal tax on whiskey. Washington saw it as a direct challenge to federal authority. He didn't just send troops, he actually rode out with the militia himself, partly to show the government's resolve. The rebellion collapsed quickly. It proved the new government could enforce its laws, unlike under the Articles.
What about foreign policy? Still issues with Britain?
Oh yeah, imprisonment was still happening. The British Navy seizing American sailors. Tensions were high. Washington sent John Jay to negotiate a treaty with Britain. The Jay Treaty averted war but was very unpopular with Jefferson's faction, who were more sympathetic to France, especially after the French Revolution.
So the political divisions Washington feared were already growing.
Definitely. The Federalists, favoring strong central government and ties with Britain, versus the Democratic Republicans, led by Jefferson, favoring states' rights and supporting France. Washington warned strongly against permanent political parties in his farewell address.
And his final act, stepping down after 2 terms.
Hugely significant. setting that precedent against becoming a president for life, preventing a dynasty. It reinforced the Republican ideals.
Okay, then John Adams takes over in 1797. His presidency was rocky.
Quite rocky. He faced the quasi-war with France, undeclared naval battles. He also signed the Alien and Sedition Acts, which were hugely controversial. They restricted immigration and made it illegal to criticize the government, seen by Democratic Republicans as a direct attack on free speech.
But he avoided full-scale war with France.
He did. Brokered a peace deal, which actually angered some in his own Federalist Party who wanted war. Adams also holds the distinction of being the first president to live in the new White House.
Then comes Jefferson in 1801. A big shift.
A major shift. The Revolution of 1800, he called it. Ushered in a long period, about 25 years, of Democratic-Republican dominance.
And his biggest achievement, probably the Louisiana Purchase.
Without a doubt. 1803. Napoleon needed money for his wars in Europe, so he offered to sell this vast territory to the U.S. too. Jefferson, despite some constitutional qualms about presidential power to buy land, seized the opportunity, doubled the size of the country overnight, opened up that entirely new frontier.
And he wanted to know what was out there, Lewis and Clark.
Exactly. Commissioned Meriwether Lewis and William Clark in 1804 to explore this new territory. Their mission: map it, find a water route to the Pacific if possible, establish relations with native tribes, document plants and animals.
And Sacagawea's role was crucial.
Incredibly important. A Shoshone woman, she served as an interpreter and guide, helped them navigate and negotiate with different tribes. The expedition was a remarkable success, brought back invaluable maps, scientific knowledge, and strengthened the U.S. claim to the region. Contacted over 70 tribes, produced 140 maps, documented hundreds of species.
But foreign policy troubles continued, leading to another war with Britain.
Yes, the War of 1812, under President James Madison. The causes were building for years. Both Britain and France were interfering with American shipping during the Napoleonic Wars. Impressment was still a major issue. Plus, suspicions the British were arming Native Americans on the frontier, and they still hadn't fully evacuated those western forts.
And there were voices pushing for war.
The war hawks in Congress, like Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun, young, ambitious politicians pushing for a more assertive stance against Britain. Madison finally asked Congress for a declaration of war in June 1812.
Was the U.S. ready?
Not really. The Army and Navy were small, unprepared for a major conflict. Early attempts to invade Canada failed, though American forces did burn York, the provincial capital, now Toronto. The Navy actually performed surprisingly well in single-ship duels.
Tecumseh played a role here too, allied with the British.
Yes, the Shawnee leader Tecumseh formed a powerful confederacy of tribes, allied with the British, resisting American expansion. They kept the U.S. military tied down in the Northwest until Tecumseh was killed in battle in 1813, which weakened the Confederacy.
Then the British went on the offensive, after dealing with Napoleon.
Right. They turned their attention to the U.S., launched a major attack on the Chesapeake Bay region in 1814, marched on Washington, D.C.
And burned the White House.
They did. After routing American militia at the Battle of Bladensburg, President Madison had to flee. Dolly Madison famously saved the portrait of George Washington and other valuables before the British arrived.
But the Americans held firm at Baltimore, Fort McHenry.
That was a key moment. The British bombardment of Fort McHenry failed to force its surrender. Francis Scott Key, watching from a British ship where he was negotiating a prisoner release, saw the American flag still flying the next morning and was inspired to write the Star-Spangled Banner.
How did the war end? Did anyone really win?
It ended with the Treaty of Ghent in late 1814. Essentially a stalemate. Borders were restored to pre-war lines. Very little territory changed hands. Ironically, the biggest U.S. victory, the Battle of New Orleans under Andrew Jackson, happened after the peace treaty was signed, but before the news reached America.
So not much gained territorially, but what was the larger significance?
It was huge, psychologically and internationally. The U.S. had taken on the world's greatest superpower again and fought them to a standstill. It proved the young republic was durable, that it wasn't going away. It solidified national identity and earned greater respect on the world stage. The U.S. was here, and they were here to stay.
Okay, post-war of 1812, the focus shifts increasingly westward, this idea of continentalism.
Yeah, this powerful belief emerged in the 19th century that the U.S. was destined, maybe even divinely ordained, to stretch across the entire continent, from sea to shining sea.
Louisiana Purchase got them to the Rockies. How did the rest fill in?
Treaties with Spain clarified the Florida border and ceded Florida itself. Treaties with Britain established the northern border with Canada more clearly. And then came the Monroe Doctrine in 1823.
President James Monroe basically telling Europe to stay out of the Americas?
Pretty much. He declared the Western Hemisphere off limits to further European colonization. Any attempt would be seen as a threat to the U.S. It was a bold statement asserting American dominance in its own hemisphere.
And manifest destiny becomes the term for this whole expansionist drive.
It pops up in the 1840s during disputes with Britain over the Oregon Territory. It captured this widespread, almost religious belief that Americans had an unquestionable right and duty to spread their institutions across the continent. This fueled massive westward migration.
But that journey west, it wasn't easy. The Oregon Trail.
Grueling. A 2,000-mile trek from Missouri to Oregon. Hundreds of thousands made the journey, lured by promises of cheap land and opportunity from speculators. But it was incredibly dangerous. Disease, accidents, weather.
The Donner Party is the most infamous example, right?
A truly horrific story. Trapped by snow in the Sierra Nevada mountains in the winter of 1846-47, they resorted to cannibalism to survive. It's a stark reminder of the extreme hardships and risks people faced.
Were there other ways west?
Some took the long sea route around Cape Horn in South America. Took about 6 months. Others carved out different paths. The Mormon Exodus saw 70,000 members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints migrate to Utah's Salt Lake Valley starting in 1847, seeking refuge from persecution.
And then gold was discovered in California.
1848. Right after California became U.S. territory after the Mexican-American War, sparked the gold rush, a massive flood of people heading west, hoping to strike it rich, completely transformed California.
Let's talk about Texas. Its story is deeply tied to this expansion and also to slavery.
Absolutely. Initially, the Mexican government encouraged American settlement in Texas, partly as a buffer against Comanche raids. They offered cheap land. Many settlers came from the American South, and they brought enslaved people with them.
Even though Mexico opposed slavery.
Mexico abolished slavery in 1829. This, plus other restrictions like banning further U.S. immigration, led to rising tensions. Anglo settlers felt their way of life was threatened. This eventually erupted into the Texas Revolution in 1836.
And the Alamo
became the legendary symbol of Texan defiance. Fewer than 300 defenders held out for 13 days against Santa Anna's much larger army. Figures like William Travis, James Bowie, Davy Crockett were there. All the defenders who survived the final assault were executed. Remember, the Alamo became the rallying cry.
But Texas won its independence shortly after.
Yes, at the Battle of San Jacinto in April 1836. Santa Anna was captured, and Texas became an independent republic.
And they immediately wanted to join the U.S.
The predominantly American population did. But it was hugely controversial because Texas allowed slavery. Admitting Texas would upset the delicate balance between free and slave states in Congress. Arguments raged for nearly a decade before Texas was finally annexed in 1845.
And annexation led directly to war with Mexico.
It did, because the border between Texas and Mexico was disputed. President James K. Polk, a firm believer in manifest destiny, saw an opportunity. He offered to buy the disputed land, plus California and New Mexico. Mexico refused.
So Polk provoked a fight.
Essentially, yes. He sent U.S. troops into the disputed territory along the Rio Grande. Mexican forces attacked them. Polk used this clash to claim Mexico had shed American blood upon American soil and convinced Congress to declare war in 1846.
Was it a fair fight?
Not really. The U.S. military was better equipped, better organized. Mexico was politically unstable, its army poorly supplied. The U.S. won a series of victories, eventually capturing Mexico City. Mexico was forced to cede a vast amount of territory: California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, parts of Colorado, and Wyoming.
This massive expansion just kept raising the unavoidable question.
Slavery. Would these new territories allow it or not? Every new state admitted threatened that fragile balance of power in Congress between the slaveholding South and the free North. The institution, present since 1619, was now tearing the nation apart.
And the tension wasn't just political debate. It turned violent even within the government.
Shockingly so. In 1854, Congressman Preston Brooks of South Carolina walked into the Senate chamber and beat Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts unconscious with a cane because Sumner had given an anti-slavery speech that insulted Brooks's relative.
On the Senate floor.
On the Senate floor. Abolitionists were horrified, saw it as proof of Southern brutality and control. Southerners mostly cheered Brooks as a hero defending Southern honor, a chilling sign of how deep the divide had become.
The compromises over the territory gained from Mexico, they didn't last.
The Compromise of 1850 tried. California came in as a free state, the slave trade was banned in D.C., but it also included a much stricter Fugitive Slave Act.
Requiring Northerners to help return escaped slaves.
Yes. It forced Northerners to participate in the system, which many found morally repugnant. It inflamed tensions further. Then came Bleeding Kansas, popular sovereignty failing violently, and then John Brown's raid.
Harper's Ferry, 1859.
John Brown, the fervent abolitionist, believed slavery could only be ended by violence. He led a raid on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, hoping to seize weapons and ignite a massive slave uprising.
Did it work?
No. The local militia and then U.S. Marines, under Colonel Robert E. Lee, quickly surrounded the arsenal. Brown was captured, tried for treason against Virginia, and hanged.
Martyr in the North, terrorist in the South.
Exactly. His raid terrified the South, confirming their worst fears about Northern intentions. In the North, many saw him as a righteous martyr. It polarized the nation completely. It really felt like, as the documentary said, conflict was now inevitable.
And the election of 1860 was the breaking point.
The final straw. Abraham Lincoln, running on a platform opposing the expansion of slavery, won the presidency without carrying a single Southern state. For the South, this meant their way of life, their entire political and economic system based on slavery, was doomed.
So South Carolina seceded, December 1860.
Led the way. Other Deep South states quickly followed, forming the Confederate States of America. The outgoing president, James Buchanan, did basically nothing. Lincoln inherited a fractured nation.
And the first crisis? Fort Sumter.
A federal fort in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. Buchanan hadn't resupplied it.
Yeah.
Lincoln faced a dilemma: abandon it and seem weak, or try to resupply it and risk war. He chose a middle path. Informed South Carolina he was sending a ship with only food, no troops or weapons.
Trying to avoid provocation.
Yes, but the Confederates couldn't allow a federal fort to remain in their territory. Confederate President Jefferson Davis ordered General P.T.G. Beauregard to demand the fort's surrender, and if refused, to take it by force.
And they opened fire.
April 12, 1861, Confederate batteries bombarded Fort Sumter for 34 hours. Remarkably, no Union soldiers were killed in the bombardment itself. Major Anderson, the Union commander, surrendered the fort on April 13.
How did the North react?
The attack on the flag galvanized the North. Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion. States that had been hesitant, like New Jersey and Delaware, rallied to the Union cause.
And the South's reaction to Lincoln's call for troops?
Seen as an act of coercion and invasion. 4 more states, Virginia, Tennessee, Arkansas, and North Carolina, seceded and joined the Confederacy. The lines were drawn. The Confederacy knew it was fighting for its survival, fundamentally to preserve slavery. They believed they had to win quickly.
So the Civil War begins. What were the overall strategies?
The Union, under General Winfield Scott initially, adopted the Anaconda Plan, a naval blockade to choke the South's economy, plus a drive down the Mississippi River to split the Confederacy in two. The Confederacy, with fewer resources, needed decisive battlefield victories, maybe even invade the North, to gain foreign recognition and break the Union's will to fight. European aid was a long shot. Britain and France had abolished slavery.
The war raged for years. What were the major turning points? 1863 seems critical.
Absolutely pivotal. In the West, General Ulysses S. Grant finally captured Vicksburg, Mississippi, in July after a long siege. Gave the Union complete control of the Mississippi River, cut the Confederacy in two, just as the Anaconda Plan envisioned.
And in the East, Gettysburg.
At the same time, July 1863, Confederate General Robert E. Lee made his boldest move, invading Pennsylvania, hoping a victory on Northern soil would shatter Union morale. He met the Union Army under General George Meade at Gettysburg. 3 days of brutal fighting. Lee was decisively defeated.
The high tide of the Confederacy.
That's what Gettysburg is often called. Lee's army was battered, his offensive capability crippled. After Vicksburg and Gettysburg, the Confederacy was largely on the defensive, so the war would drag on for almost 2 more years.
And Lincoln shifted the war's purpose, the Emancipation Proclamation.
Yes. Issued after the Battle of Antietam in 1862, it went into effect January 1st, 1863. It declared slaves in Confederate-held territory to be free. A brilliant strategic and moral move. It weakened the Confederacy, prevented Britain from intervening on their side, and transformed the Union cause into a fight against slavery. It also authorized the recruitment of black soldiers into the Union Army.
The colored troops.
Yes, they fought bravely and played a crucial role in the Union victory. The war became increasingly brutal. Grant took command of all Union armies in 1864.
And pursued a relentless strategy against Lee.
Total war. Grant hammered Lee's army in Virginia, accepting huge casualties, knowing the Union could replace its losses and the Confederacy couldn't. Meanwhile, General William Tecumseh Sherman marched through the West, captured Atlanta, then marched to the sea, devastating Georgia and the Carolinas, breaking the South's economic capacity and will to fight.
How did it finally end?
Lee's army, starting and depleted, was finally cornered by Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. Lee surrendered on April 9, 1865. Sherman accepted the surrender of the remaining Confederate forces soon after. The war was over.
The cost.
Immense. 4 years, over 600,000 American lives lost. But the Union was preserved, and just before the end, Lincoln had pushed Congress to pass the 13th Amendment.
Officially abolishing slavery everywhere in the U.S.
Forever. A permanent change bought at a terrible price.
So the war ends, slavery is abolished, but the struggle wasn't over. Reconstruction begins, trying to rebuild the South and integrate millions of newly freed African Americans.
A hugely ambitious and ultimately fraught period. It was met with immediate and violent resistance from white Southerners determined to maintain supremacy. Groups like the Ku Klux Klan emerged, using terror and intimidation against Black Americans and white Republicans who supported Reconstruction.
President Grant tried to uphold Reconstruction goals.
He did, during his presidency starting in 1869. Used federal troops to try to protect Black voting rights and suppress the Klan. But Northern commitment waned over time. The Compromise of 1877, which settled a disputed presidential election, effectively ended Reconstruction. Federal troops were withdrawn from the South.
And the rights Black Americans had gained
were systematically stripped away over the following decades through segregation laws, voter disenfranchisement, and continued violence. It ushered in the Jim Crow era. This period, roughly from the end of Reconstruction to the turn of the century, is often called the Gilded Age.
Gilded Age. Shiny on the surface, but rotten underneath.
Exactly. A time of incredible industrial growth and technological innovation, but also extreme inequality, political corruption, and social unrest. The Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1869.
Connecting the coasts. Huge deal.
Massive. Cut travel time from months to less than a week. Sped up settlement of the West, exploitation of its resources. But this expansion came at a terrible cost to Native Americans.
More conflict as settlers moved onto their lands.
Constant conflict. The Homestead Act and Railroad Acts essentially gave away native lands to settlers and corporations, led to numerous wars, forced relocations onto reservations, the destruction of traditional ways of life.
And this era also gave us the Wild West legends.
Yes, the rapid settlement, mining booms like the Silver Rush in Tombstone, Arizona, the vast distances. Law enforcement was stretched thin, outlaws like Billy the Kid, lawmen like Wyatt Earp. Their exploits became part of American folklore.
Meanwhile, back east, industry was booming.
Exploding. Between 1865 and 1898, output of wheat, corn, coal, railway track, all skyrocketed. Railroads were the engine of the economy, employing almost 1 million workers by 1890.
But working conditions were terrible.
Often brutal. Railroad work was dangerous, poorly paid. Mechanization in factories replaced skilled artisans with low-wage, unskilled labor, often immigrants working long hours in unsafe conditions. Wealth became incredibly concentrated.
Top 10% owned most of the wealth.
Over 3/4 of the nation's wealth by some estimates. This stark inequality fueled major labor unrest. Huge, often violent strikes became common.
The Great Railroad Strike of 1877
shut down much of the country. Lasted almost 2 months. Federal troops were called in. Over 100 people died. Then the Haymarket Affair in Chicago in 1886. A bombing at a labor rally led to a crackdown on unions and immigrant radicals.
And the Pullman Strike in 1894.
A classic example. George Pullman cut wages at his railroad car company, but didn't lower rents in the company town where workers were forced to live. Workers went on strike, led by Eugene V. Debs and the American Railway Union. It paralyzed national rail traffic.
How did the government respond?
President Grover Cleveland sent in federal troops, citing interference with U.S. mail. Got a court injunction to break the strike. Debs was jailed. The strike failed, cost workers dearly. But a federal investigation later criticized Pullman's actions as un-American.
And Labor Day became a holiday partly because of this unrest.
Yes, Cleveland's administration designated it a federal holiday shortly after the Pullman strike, partly as a conciliatory gesture to organize labor. This era also produced the robber barons.
Rockefeller, Carnegie, Vanderbilt, Morgan, industrial titans.
Built vast empires in oil, steel, railroads, finance, known for philanthropy later in life. But their methods were often ruthless, crushing competitors, exploiting workers, forming monopolies, using political influence.
But people were exposing this, the muckrakers.
Yes, a new generation of investigative journalists. Upton Sinclair's The Jungle exposed the horrific conditions in Chicago's meatpacking plants, leading to public outrage and the Pure Food and Drug Act. Ida Tarbell's expose of Standard Oil helped lead to its breakup as a monopoly. Jacob Riis used photography in How the Other Half Lives to show the appalling conditions in New York's slums, spurring reforms.
So amidst the inequality and exploitation, cities were also transforming in positive ways.
Absolutely. Despite the slums and tenements, cities saw amazing technological advancements. Huge new bridges like the Brooklyn Bridge, though its construction was perilous, killing workers from caisson disease or the bends. Trolley lines, subways, elevators allowed cities to grow upwards and outwards. Skyscrapers began to reshape skylines.
And electricity, Edison's light bulb.
A game changer. Invented in 1879, his Pearl Street power station started supplying electricity to Lower Manhattan in 1882. Lit up homes, streets, factories. Radically changed daily life.
And there was even a mysterious meat shower in Kentucky.
Bizarre, right, 1876. Chunks of meat reportedly fell from the sky. Never fully explained. A weird footnote in a time of massive change.
All this turmoil and change sets the stage for the progressive era. Late 19th, early 20th century, a push for reform.
Exactly. A reaction against the excesses of the Gilded Age, the inequality, corruption, unsafe conditions. The Panic of 1893, a major economic depression, also fueled demands for change. People started believing government could and should play a role in solving social problems.
And Theodore Roosevelt becomes president in 1901, embodying this new spirit.
Very much so. Youngest president ever at that point. Energetic, assertive. He used the Sherman Antitrust Act to go after monopolies trust busting, starting with J.P. Morgan's railroad conglomerate. A big shift from previous presidents who often sided with big business.
He acted as a mediator in strikes.
Yes, the 1902 coal strike. Instead of just sending troops to break it, he brought both sides to the White House and brokered a compromise. Called it his square deal, balancing the interests of business, labor, and the public. Focused on conserving natural resources too, protecting consumers.
Who were the other reformers? Were they mostly middle class?
Largely, yes. Educated, often middle-class women were very active. Jane Addams and Ellen Gates Starr founded Hull House in Chicago in 1889, a settlement house providing services to poor immigrants. They fought for safer workplaces, better sanitation, purer food. The Great Molasses Flood in Boston in 1919, though later, underscored the need for corporate regulation after that tank exploded, killing 21 people.
And reforms happened at the state and local level, too.
Definitely. Things like the initiative and referendum allowing citizens to vote directly on laws, public utility commissions to regulate rates, zoning boards to try and clean up slums, improve city planning, streamlining government, making it more responsive.
There's also a moral reform element, temperance.
Yes. Groups like the Women's Christian Temperance Union, WCTU, and the Anti-Saloon League were powerful forces pushing to ban alcohol. The YMCA promoted moral uplift. This eventually led to national prohibition with the 18th Amendment in 1919.
And black communities were organizing for reform, too.
Absolutely, especially in the segregated South. Facing enormous obstacles, they worked tirelessly to improve their own schools, push for fair state funding, challenged discrimination through legal action, undertook environmental efforts in their communities. Incredible resilience.
But this era was also called the nadir of race relations. Things got worse for African Americans.
Tragically, yes. Alongside the progressive reforms, for some, this period saw intense racial violence and the solidification of Jim Crow segregation. The Supreme Court's Plessy v. Ferguson decision in 1896 upheld separate but equal, giving legal cover to segregation.
Lynchings, mob violence.
Widespread and horrific. This terror, combined with lack of opportunity, fueled the great migration of black Americans moving north, seeking safety and jobs in cities like Chicago, New York, Detroit. But even there, they faced segregation and racism, like in sundown towns, where they weren't allowed after dark.
Even President Wilson segregated federal facilities.
Woodrow Wilson, often seen as a progressive, actually oversaw the segregation of the federal workforce in 1913, rolling back progress made earlier. And the racist film Birth of a Nation in 1915 glorified the original KKK and is credited with sparking its massive resurgence in the 1920s.
The Klan became powerful nationwide.
Shockingly powerful. Millions of members by the mid-1920s, influencing politics not just in the South, but in states like Indiana, Oregon, Colorado. They targeted not just black Americans, but also Catholics, Jews, immigrants, and women, challenging traditional roles.
The Red Summer of 1919.
A wave of horrific white supremacist riots and massacres in dozens of cities. dozens, likely hundreds of black people murdered. State governments largely failed to prosecute the perpetrators, angered many black WWI veterans who had fought for democracy abroad only to face terror at home.
And voting rights were systematically denied?
Yes, despite the 15th Amendment, Southern states used poll taxes, literacy tests, and things like the grandfather clause, allowing men to vote only if their ancestors could vote before 1867, effectively disenfranchising almost all black men. Declared unconstitutional in 1915, but similar tactics persisted until the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
But amidst this darkness, there was a major victory for women: suffrage.
Yes, the long fight for women's right to vote finally succeeded. Groups like the WCTU had pushed for it. Alice Paul's National Women's Party, formed in 1916, used more aggressive tactics, focusing solely on a constitutional amendment.
World War I played a role.
It did. Women entering the workforce in huge numbers during the war demonstrated their capabilities and importance to the nation. This helped build momentum. Finally, the 19th Amendment was ratified on August 18, 1920, a landmark achievement prohibiting voting discrimination based on sex.
While all this is happening domestically, the U.S. is also projecting power abroad. Imperialism. Hawaii.
Yes, U.S. influence in Hawaii had been growing for decades. Missionaries, sugar planters, trade. The U.S. Navy leased Pearl Harbor in 1887. In 1893, American planters backed by U.S. Marines brought ashore, ostensibly to keep the peace, overthrew Queen Liliuokalani.
Was it seen as legitimate back in the U.S.?
President Cleveland actually condemned it as an illegal coup. But the provisional government, led by American businessmen, held on, and Hawaii was declared a republic in 1894, eventually annexed by the U.S. in 1898 during the Spanish-American War. Queen Liliuokalani opposed it peacefully for the rest of her life.
The Spanish-American War, 1898. What triggered that?
Cuba. Cuban rebels were fighting for independence from Spain. The U.S. public was sympathetic, partly due to sensationalist yellow journalism graphically portraying Spanish atrocities. There were also significant American economic interests in Cuban sugar.
And the USS Maine.
The battleship USS Maine exploded and sank in Havana Harbor in February 1898. The cause was unclear, likely an internal accident, but the press immediately blamed Spain. Remember, the Maine became a war cry.
So the U.S. declared war.
Congress declared Cuba independent, demanded Spain withdraw, authorized President McKinley to use force. Spain refused, severed diplomatic ties. McKinley ordered a naval blockade of Cuba, and Spain declared war.
Where did the fighting happen first, not Cuba?
Surprisingly, no. The first major action was in the Philippines, another Spanish colony. Commodore George Dewey sailed the U.S. Asiatic Squadron into Manila Bay and destroyed the Spanish fleet there in a matter of hours, with minimal U.S. casualties. Dewey famously paused the battle for breakfast.
And then the Caribbean.
Yes, the U.S. focused on defeating the Spanish fleet and army in Cuba and Puerto Rico. Theodore Roosevelt and his Rough Riders gained fame at the Battle of San Juan Hill. The war was over quickly, by August. John Hay called it a splendid little war.
What did the U.S. gain?
Spain gave up Cuba, which became nominally independent but under heavy U.S. influence. Spain also ceded Puerto Rico and Guam to the U.S., and controversially, Spain sold the Philippines to the U.S. for $20 million. This led to a brutal war between U.S. forces and Filipino nationalists who wanted independence, not a new colonial master.
Another huge project from this era, the Panama Canal.
A long-held dream, really. Since the first explorers, people looked for a shortcut between the Atlantic and Pacific. Avoid that long trip around South America.
And Theodore Roosevelt made it happen.
He was determined. The U.S. took over a failed French attempt. They had to overcome incredible challenges. Disease, especially yellow fever, malaria, spread by mosquitoes, excavating through mountains, designing the complex system of locks.
When did it open?
August 15, 1914. Just as World War I was breaking out in Europe, it was the most expensive U.S. project ever at the time, about $375 million.
And the human cost?
Terrible. Thousands of workers died, mostly from disease and accidents. Official figures list over 5,600 deaths just during the U.S. construction phase from 1904 to 1913, and that's likely an underestimate. Mostly black workers from the Caribbean.
But its impact was huge.
Transformative for global trade and naval strategy. A major symbol of American power and technological prowess in the progressive era. Still considered a marvel of engineering.
Okay, so the U.S. is a global power, reforming at home, but then Europe explodes into World War I in 1914. U.S. stance initially.
Neutrality. President Woodrow Wilson declared the U.S. neutral. Strong isolationist sentiment in the country didn't want to get dragged into Europe's war.
What changed that?
Several things. German submarine warfare was a major factor. The sinking of the British passenger liner Lusitania in 1915 killed over 1,000 people, including 128 Americans. Public opinion began to shift. Economic ties to Britain and France also pulled the U.S. towards the Allies.
And the final push, the Zimmermann telegram.
That was key. In early 1917, British intelligence intercepted and deciphered a secret telegram from Germany to Mexico. Germany proposed a military alliance with Mexico if the U.S. entered the war, promising Mexico lost territories like Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona in return. When this was published, it outraged Americans. Wilson asked Congress to declare war on Germany in April 1917.
How did the U.S. mobilize?
Massively. Millions drafted or enlisted. The economy completely pivoted to war production. The government launched huge propaganda campaigns through the Committee on Public Information, CPI posters, movies, rallies to build support and demonize the Germans.
And they clamped down on dissent.
Yes, the Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918 made it illegal to interfere with the draft or even criticize the government or the war effort. Thousands were prosecuted, patriotism was heavily promoted, victory gardens encouraged, war bonds sold, income taxes increased.
Women's roles changed significantly during the war.
Dramatically. With millions of men overseas, women stepped into factory jobs, including munitions plants. They served as nurses, clerks, and telephone operators in the military, like the bilingual Hello Girls of the Army Signal Corps. Accepted reluctantly at first, they proved indispensable.
What was the human cost for the U.S.?
Relatively low compared to the European powers, but still significant. About 53,000 battle deaths, another 63,000 deaths from disease, mostly the 1918 flu pandemic, and accidents.
And after the war, what about the peace treaty, Wilson's League of Nations?
Wilson went to Versailles with his idealistic 14 points plan for a just peace, including the creation of a League of Nations to prevent future wars. But the treaty negotiations were complex, and the final treaty was harsh on Germany.
Did the U.S. join the League?
No. Wilson faced strong opposition back home, particularly from Republican senators led by Henry Cabot Lodge. Wilson had made political mistakes, excluding leading Republicans from the peace delegation. He refused to compromise on the treaty terms. The Senate rejected the Treaty of Versailles the first time it had ever rejected a peace treaty. The U.S. never joined the League of Nations, signing a separate peace with Germany later.
So the U.S. retreats into isolationism again after the war. But the 1920s roared.
It was a decade of contradictions. Politically isolationist, yes. Economically, farmers struggled as post-war demand collapsed. But culturally, it was the jazz age. Cars became more common. Radios brought new sounds into homes. Jazz clubs thrived, especially in cities like Chicago and New York, fueled by the great migration of black artists from the South.
And this led to new kinds of social interaction.
It did. In some places, like Chicago's black and tan clubs, whites and blacks mingled socially, listening to jazz in ways that were unprecedented, challenging segregation norms.
But there was backlash against jazz itself.
Oh, definitely. Many conservatives saw jazz, with its roots in black culture and improvisational style, as immoral, primitive, the devil's music, associated with speakeasies, flappers, loosening morals. Dozens of communities banned jazz dances, even respected figures like Thomas Edison mocked it.
And the KKK had a massive resurgence in the 20s.
Frighteningly so. Fueled by post-war anxieties, anti-immigrant sentiment, and racism amplified by Birth of a Nation, they claimed millions of members, targeting not just blacks, but also Catholics, Jews, immigrants. They held huge parades, wielded significant political power in several states.
The Tulsa Race Massacre happened during this period, 1921.
Yes, a horrific event. A white mob, incited by false allegations, attacked and destroyed the prosperous black neighborhood of Greenwood in Tulsa, Oklahoma, burned it to the ground, killed dozens, possibly hundreds. One of the worst incidents of racial violence in American history. The Klan's influence grew afterwards.
And then there was Prohibition, 1920 to 1933. Did it work?
Well, it drove drinking underground. Speakeasies flourished. It created a massive, violent black market for alcohol run by organized crime syndicates like Al Capone's in Chicago. Corruption of police and politicians was rampant. While some statistics suggest overall alcohol consumption might have decreased slightly, the lawlessness and unintended consequences were huge. Even John D. Rockefeller, a teetotaler, eventually concluded it was a failure, creating disrespect for the law.
The Roaring Twenties came crashing down with the stock market crash of 1929.
Black Tuesday, October 1929, marked the beginning of the Great Depression. The speculative bubble burst. Optimism evaporated. Projects like the Empire State Building, started during the boom, stood largely empty for years.
How bad did it get?
Devastating. Thousands of banks failed, wiping out people's savings. Unemployment soared, eventually reaching 25%. Homelessness became widespread. Hooverville's shantytowns sprang up. People lost farms, businesses,
And the Dust Bowl made things even worse.
an ecological catastrophe on top of the economic one. Severe drought hit the Great Plains in the 1930s. Combined with poor farming practices, it led to massive dust storms that blackened the sky, killed crops and livestock, forced hundreds of thousands of Okies and others to abandon their farms and migrate, often to California.
How did President Hoover respond?
Herbert Hoover, a Republican, believed in limited government intervention, voluntary cooperation, and rugged individualism. He resisted direct federal relief, believing it would undermine self-reliance. His measures were seen as too little, too late. The public blamed him, hence Hoovervilles.
So in 1932, Americans elected Franklin D. Roosevelt.
Overwhelmingly, FDR, a Democrat, promised a New Deal. He radiated confidence and took immediate action upon taking office in 1933, famous for his first 100 days where Congress passed a whirlwind of legislation.
What were the key goals? Relief, recovery, reform.
Exactly. Laws to stabilize banks, the bank holiday, provide emergency relief, aid farmers, regulate industry, and create jobs. Programs like the Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, put young men to work. But the biggest jobs program was the Works Progress Administration, the WPA, started in 1935.
What did the WPA do?
Employed millions, 8.5 million over its lifetime on public works projects. Built roads, bridges, schools, hospitals, airports, parks, sewers. Huge infrastructure improvements across the country. Also funded artists, writers, musicians. Iconic projects like Hoover Dam, the Lincoln Tunnel, Mount Rushmore received New Deal funding.
And other lasting programs. Social Security.
Yes, the Social Security Act of 1935 created a safety net for retirees, the unemployed, disabled. Other key reforms included the National Labor Relations Act, protecting unions and collective bargaining, and the Fair Labor Standards Act, setting minimum wages and maximum hours.
How was the New Deal viewed?
Hugely popular with most Americans who felt the government was finally helping them. But controversial too. Conservatives called it socialism, government overreach, wasteful spending. It fundamentally changed the role of the federal government in American life and cemented the Democratic Party's dominance for decades.
Just as the U.S. is recovering, war breaks out again in Europe. World War II.
September 1939, Germany invades Poland. Britain and France declare war. Again, the U.S. initially stayed out. Strong isolationist sentiment remained.
But Roosevelt wasn't neutral in spirit.
No, he clearly saw the threat from Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. He looked for ways to help the Allies without formally entering the war. After France fell in 1940, he pushed through the Lend-Lease Act, allowing the U.S. to supply weapons and aid to Britain and other allied nations. The U.S. became the arsenal of democracy.
What finally brought the U.S. into the war?
Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. The surprise attack by Japan on the U.S. naval base in Hawaii killed over 2,400 Americans, destroyed much of the Pacific Fleet, unified the country overnight. The U.S. declared war on Japan the next day. Germany and Italy then declared war on the U.S.
Total mobilization.
Even bigger than WWI.
Yeah.
Millions enlisted or were drafted. Industry converted completely to war production, rationing, war bonds, a massive national effort, but also a dark side.
Japanese-American internment.
Yes, Executive Order 9066. Fear and racism led to the forced removal and incarceration of about 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry, most of them American citizens, from the West Coast into internment camps for the duration of the war. A terrible injustice.
How did the war progress in the Pacific?
Initially, Japan has stunning successes, but the Battle of Midway in June 1942 was a crucial turning point. The U.S. Navy inflicted devastating losses on the Japanese fleet, crippling their offensive capability. Then began the long, bloody island-hopping campaign, taking strategic islands like Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, getting closer and closer to Japan. Brutal fighting.
And in Europe?
The U.S. joined Britain and the Soviet Union in the fight against Hitler. Allied forces invaded North Africa in late 1942, Operation Torch, then Italy in 1943. The D-Day landings in Normandy, France, June 6, 1944, opened the major Second Front against Germany. Fierce fighting followed, including the Battle of the Bulge in late 1944. Germany finally surrendered in May 1945 after Hitler's suicide and Soviet troops capturing Berlin.
But the war with Japan continued.
Yes, FDR died suddenly in April 1945. Harry Truman became president. He was then informed about the top-secret Manhattan Project.
The atomic bomb.
Yes. Truman faced a terrible choice.
Yeah.
Invading Japan was expected to cost hundreds of thousands, maybe millions, of Allied and Japanese lives. Japan showed little sign of surrendering despite conventional bombing. Truman authorized the use of the new weapon.
Hiroshima, August 6, 1945.
Little Boy, the first atomic bomb used in warfare. Leveled the city, killed estimates vary, maybe 70,000, 80,000 instantly, many more later from radiation, still no surrender.
Nagasaki, August 9th.
Fat Man, a different type of bomb. Killed another 40,000, 80,000. The devastation was unimaginable.
And Japan finally surrendered.
Yes. Emperor Hirohito intervened, announced Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945. World War II was over. The human cost globally was staggering, estimated 80 million dead.
The U.S. emerged as a superpower. But the end of the war wasn't the beginning of peace.
No, it was the beginning of the Cold War. The wartime alliance with the Soviet Union quickly dissolved. Deep ideological differences, mistrust, Soviet actions in Eastern Europe. It led to decades of tension, rivalry, and proxy wars between the U.S. and the USSR. The atomic bomb ushered in a new, terrifying age.
The Cold War dominates the post-war decades. What defined it?
The fundamental conflict between U.S.-led capitalism and democracy and Soviet-led communism. The U.S. adopted a policy of containment, trying to stop the spread of Soviet influence. This led to a massive arms race, both conventional and nuclear. Fear of nuclear war became pervasive.
Suck and cover drills, bomb shelters.
Exactly. And at home, the Red Scare, intense fear of communist infiltration. Senator Joseph McCarthy led televised hearings, making often baseless accusations. The House Un-American Activities Committee investigated suspected communists and government Hollywood universities.
People lost jobs, were blacklisted.
Thousands. Careers ruined based on suspicion, association. A climate of fear and conformity took hold for a time. Key symbols of the Cold War divide included the Berlin Wall, built in 1961 to stop East Germans from fleeing to the West.
And the Cuban Missile Crisis, the closest we came to nuclear war.
October 1962. Terrifying. U.S. spy planes discovered Soviet nuclear missile sites being built in Cuba just 90 miles away. President Kennedy imposed a naval blockade. For 13 days, the world held its breath. It ended when Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles in exchange for a U.S. promise not to invade Cuba and a secret deal to remove U.S. missiles from Turkey. Led to a hotline between Moscow and Washington and the Limited Test Ban Treaty in 1963.
The Cold War also involved hot wars.
Yeah.
Korea.
Yes, the Korean War, 1950-1953. After communist North Korea invaded South Korea, the U.S. led a UN coalition to intervene. Brutal fighting ended in an armistice, essentially a stalemate, that left Korea divided at the 38th parallel, a division that persists today. Millions died, including about 40,000 Americans.
And then Vietnam.
A much longer, more divisive conflict. U.S. involvement began gradually, supporting the French, then backing the anti-communist South Vietnamese government against the communist North, led by Ho Chi Minh and Viet Cong insurgents in the South. Eisenhower cited the domino theory: if Vietnam fell, other Southeast Asian nations would follow.
How did it escalate?
Under Presidents Kennedy and especially Lyndon Johnson. After the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964, Johnson received broad authority from Congress to increase U.S. military involvement. Regular bombing campaigns like Operation Rolling Thunder began. Hundreds of thousands of U.S. ground troops were sent, peaking at over 500,000 by 1967. North Vietnam received aid from China and the Soviet Union.
But the war became incredibly unpopular at home.
Massively unpopular. A powerful anti-war movement grew, fueled by the draft. Rising casualties shown on TV nightly, civilian deaths, revelations about U.S. actions like the My Lai massacre, and questions about the morality and purpose of the war. Morale among troops suffered. Desertions and draft evasion were widespread.
Nixon promised peace with honor.
Richard Nixon escalated bombing campaigns, including secret bombings in Cambodia and Laos, while simultaneously pursuing negotiations and Vietnamization, shifting the fighting to South Vietnamese forces. The Pentagon Papers, leaked in 1971, revealed previous administrations had misled the public about the war's scope and prospects, further damaging trust.
How did it finally end for the U.S.?
A peace agreement was signed in Paris in January 1973, allowing the U.S. to withdraw its troops. But the fighting between North and South Vietnam continued until North Vietnam captured Saigon in April 1975, unifying the country under communist rule.
The cost of Vietnam?
Staggering. Estimated 2 million Vietnamese dead, millions more wounded or displaced. Over 58,000 Americans killed. The war deeply divided American society, eroded faith in government, and left lasting scars on a generation.
While the Cold War in Vietnam raged, another monumental struggle was happening within the U.S., the Civil Rights Movement.
Yes, challenging centuries of racial discrimination and segregation, primarily targeting the Jim Crow laws institutionalized after Reconstruction, legally underpinned by that Plessy v. Ferguson separate but equal ruling.
What was the key legal breakthrough?
Brown v. Board of Education in 1954. The Supreme Court unanimously ruled that state-sponsored segregation in public schools was unconstitutional, overturning Plessy, a landmark victory, but implementing it faced massive resistance, especially in the South.
Like the Little Rock Nine.
A powerful example. 1957. 9 black students tried to integrate Little Rock Central High School. The governor of Arkansas used the National Guard to block them. Mobs threatened them. President Eisenhower had to send in federal troops, the 101st Airborne, to escort the students into the school and protect them. Showed federal power could be used to enforce desegregation.
The movement relied heavily on nonviolent protests.
Yes, inspired by Gandhi and led by figures like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., sit-ins at segregated lunch counters, boycotts like the Montgomery bus boycott sparked by Rosa Parks, and the Freedom Rides in 1961.
The Freedom Rides faced violence.
Extreme violence. Integrated groups rode interstate buses into the Deep South to challenge segregation in terminals. They were met with beatings, firebombing, arrest by police working with the KKK. But the images of this brutality, broadcast nationally, shocked many white Americans and forced the Kennedy administration to act, enforcing desegregation on interstate travel.
Birmingham, Alabama, in 1963 was another key campaign.
Yes, targeting one of the most segregated cities. Police Commissioner Bull Connor used fire hoses and attacked dogs on peaceful protesters, including children. Again, the images horrified the nation and the world, building pressure for federal civil rights legislation. Led to the Birmingham Truce, desegregating some facilities.
And the March on Washington?
August 28, 1963. A massive demonstration for civil and economic rights. 250,000 people gathered peacefully at the Lincoln Memorial.
Where Dr. King gave his I Have a Dream speech.
One of the most powerful speeches in American history. A moving call for racial justice and equality, delivered on the centennial of the Emancipation Proclamation. It helped galvanize support for the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, landmark laws that dismantled legal segregation and protected voting rights.
Moving into the later 20th century, the Reagan era, 1980s. What characterized that?
A conservative resurgence. Reagan focused on cutting taxes, reducing government regulation, and rebuilding the military to confront the Soviet Union. Peace through strength. The Reagan doctrine involves supporting anti-communist movements worldwide, sometimes controversially, as in Nicaragua, leading to the Iran-Contra affair.
Iran-Contra. Selling arms to Iran to fund rebels in Nicaragua.
Secretly and illegally, yes. A major scandal. Domestically, Reagan also escalated the war on drugs, leading to harsher sentencing laws, mandatory minimums, and a significant increase in the prison population, disproportionately affecting minority communities.
George H.W. Bush followed Reagan, continued the war on drugs.
Yes, famously held up crack cocaine purchased near the White House in a televised address. His presidency also saw the end of the Cold War with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the first Gulf War in 1991.
Iraq invading Kuwait.
Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, threatening oil supplies. Bush assembled a broad international coalition, sanctioned by the UN, that swiftly liberated Kuwait and defeated the Iraqi army. Established the U.S. as the sole global superpower, but the aftermath created instability in the region that continues today.
The 1990s brought the rise of the internet, the dot-com bubble.
A period of massive technological change and economic optimism. Personal computers, the World Wide Web, IT companies boomed. Investors poured money into almost any company with .com in its name, often regardless of actual profit.
And then it burst.
Around 2000, 2002, the bubble burst spectacularly. Billions, maybe trillions in investor value vanished, led to a mild recession. But the companies that survived, Amazon, Google, eBay, became giants, fundamentally reshaping commerce and communication.
Then another major economic crisis, the Great Recession of 2008.
Triggered by the collapse of the U.S. housing market, fueled by risky subprime mortgages. It caused a cascade of failures in the financial system globally. The worst economic downturn since the Great Depression. Millions lost homes, jobs, major banks failed or needed bailouts.
The Obama administration took office amidst this crisis.
Yes, Barack Obama, the first African-American president elected in 2008. His administration oversaw government interventions to stabilize the financial system, stimulus packages to boost the economy, and passed major reforms like the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, for health care. In foreign policy, focused on ending the Iraq War and setting a timetable for withdrawal from Afghanistan.
followed by the Trump administration in 2017.
Donald Trump won a surprise victory in 2016 against Hillary Clinton. His presidency was marked by populist and nationalist policies, challenges to international agreements, tax cuts, and appointments of conservative judges. He reversed the planned withdrawal from Afghanistan amid concerns about the Islamic State resurgence. His election and presidency were also shadowed by investigations into Russian interference.
And that brings us almost to the present, culminating in the January 6th attack.
A shocking event. Following Trump's repeated false claims of a stolen election in 2020, a large mob of his supporters attacked the U.S. Capitol building on January 6, 2021, while Congress was certifying Joe Biden's victory. They sought to overturn the election results. The mob breached security, occupied parts of the Capitol, forced lawmakers to evacuate, a direct assault on American democratic processes. Looking back across this entire sweep of history, what's really striking, as the documentary suggests, is the constant change, often violent, disruptive change, political, social, economic. Yet somehow the United States has managed to endure, to adapt, to emerge, well, maybe not always stronger immediately, but intact. There's a resilience there.
It's quite a story. So for you, the listener, what's the takeaway from this deep dive? I mean, it shows this incredible, almost relentless drive, doesn't it? This adaptability, sometimes stumbling, often fighting amongst themselves, but always pushing forward, trying to live up to or maybe redefine that great experiment started almost 250 years ago.
A continuous struggle with its own ideals.
Exactly. It really leaves you thinking, doesn't it? After all these transformations, all these conflicts and triumphs, what comes next, what new challenges, what new changes are waiting for this incredibly diverse, complex nation in the future?